Hello my friends, my name is Luisa and this is the Lulu Blue Studio. Today we're going to talk all about color values, what are color values and how we can use them to create a flower composition similar to this one. In first place, let's speak about color values from the technical point of view. What are color values? Color values is basically the lightness or darkness of a color. For example, if I mix with a little bit of water some red, this is some scarlet red from my color palette, and I start to add this on the paper, I obtain the darkest color value of this scarlet red. This is the darkest, that means the most intense color value of this red, and this color value can be changed by removing part of the pigment into the cup of water, as I've done. And if I lay onto the paper the brush now, I will obtain a lighter color value. By removing again the pigment in the cup of water, I will obtain a lighter color value. So this is an example to explain you what color values are. If you have your color with a little bit of water and the most concentrated amount of color, you will obtain and you will have the darkest color value, and is the darkest sort of color you can obtain with that pigment. By removing part of the pigment in the cup of water, you will have lighter color values of the same color. When you touch with your brush, your color palette with a color, that amount of color that you take from your color palette goes a long way. So you can stretch that amount of color by removing into the cup of water a lot or a little bit of that color, and you can obtain different color values. And this is very important in watercolor because it's one of the main techniques that will allow you to obtain flower compositions, for example, that are rich, that are full of movement, and that look more realistic, although they are in a loose style. Now I want to show you one of the techniques I use very often in the flower compositions, that is starting from the darkest color value. You can create, for example, a swatch, and then by just removing part of the pigment in the cup of water and just using mainly water, you can still touch the dark swatch and create lighter values with your brush. This is a technique that I recommend you to use to create your flower composition, and that we are going to adopt right now in this floral composition that we are going to create together. So this is going to be a very simple flower composition, but we are going to master how to use color values to create flowers. Let's start. So in this floral composition, we are going to practice values, so you can use any color you have on your color palette. In this example, I am mixing a little bit of scarlet red with some quinacridone magenta. And when I obtain a mixture that I like with the darkest value I have, I start to create the first petal. As soon as the first petal is created, I remove part of the pigment in the cup of water, and with the remaining lighter value of this color, I start to use the side of my brush to create these additional brush strokes. The central petal is the darkest valued and the darkest colored petal that you see in the peony I'm creating. All the other petals are removing part of the pigment in the cup of water, and so they are created in a lighter valued color. The color is always the same because it's always a mixture of this scarlet red with the quinacridone magenta. But I'm playing mainly with the amount of pigment that I have on the brush and the amount of pigment that I remove into the cup of water to create different petals with different color values. Usually the first petals I create are darker, and then I even touch these darker petals with the side of the brush and with a very little amount of pigment and more amount of water to create lighter petals that are lighter in color value. I started to create the second flower in the same way. The very first two petals are very dark in color value. Then I remove a part of the pigment in the cup of water, and just with the side of the brush and a little bit of pigment and more water, I started to create additional brush strokes that are petals, outer petals of this peony. Playing with these color values will allow your peonies to seem a little bit more realistic, although they are still in loose style, and to have more character and to bring a little bit more movement into the whole composition. When I started to create the third peony, I used the same approach, and therefore I start with the darkest valued petals. When then I remove the pigment in the cup of water, I started to create lighter petals. That means petals that are lighter in color because there is less pigment on the brush. You can create many effects by playing with the color values. You can also, for example, create the very first petal as the darkest in your composition, and then removing completely all the pigment from your brush, you can just use water to start creating the other petals just by touching slightly the darkest petal you have just created. In this way, you will play with the wet in wet technique, and you will have beautiful bleeding effects from the darkest petal to the petals that are created just with water. You can, of course, use the same technique of changing the color values to create different leaves on your compositions. We are going to create leaves in this flower composition by using a round brush in size 12. This is a thicker round brush, and mixing a little bit of sub-green and green earth. Mainly the leaves are quite simple and created just by touching with the belly of the brush the paper, and they are placed around the main flowers like they are sort of framing all of these main flowers. In this case, I'm not just changing the color value, but I'm changing also the color hue. The color hue is the type of color that I'm using to create these leaves. So I'm changing the color hue, for example, when in first place I'm using sub-green, and then, for example, I create additional leaves using, for example, azomethyl green yellow. That is another sort of green that I have on my color palette. So when you mix the different colors together, you will obtain different color hues. So now let's recap how to use color values to create depth and movement. First, start by creating the first petal with the most concentrated amount of pigment on your brush. That is the darkest color value. Then remove part of the pigment in the cup of water and use this amount of pigment with a little amount of water to create the other petals. Then keep removing your pigment on the brush and keep adding water to create lighter valued brush strokes that are the petals of your flowers. Of course, you can use the same approach not only for the petals of your flowers, but also for the leaves. At this point, the main flowers and the leaves are created, so I use a small brush in size 6 to start to create the center of the flowers. And the center of the flowers are created by just touching with the tip of this brush the paper, and by adding not so much pressure. I create a few dots and some straight lines to create the center of these peonies. This flower composition is very simple. The aim of this video is not to create something too complicated, but something that is simple to understand what color values are and how they can be used in your floral compositions. I know that this tutorial is a little bit more technical and probably a little bit less playful compared to other flower composition we have made together on this channel, but I really think that the technique and understanding color values is fundamental to understand how watercolor works and to obtain flower compositions that are going to be more realistic and lively. You can also add some depth to your petals by adding a few brush strokes, as I am doing through the wet on dry technique. So I'm adding a few brush strokes when the petals are already completely dry, and I'm using the same colors, so a mixture of scarlet red and quinacridone magenta, to create these additional brush strokes. I really hope you enjoyed and you learned something from this tutorial. If you like videos like this one, please subscribe to this channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.